fun, visual, simple way of trying to give you tools to help the world around us, which is really being blinded by the idea that God's word is absolutely accurate because they hear a whole nother account of where everything came from. Give you tools to do it in a visual, interesting, engaging way. One of the tools people have found like the most useful, I have co-authored 4 different devotionals where every day of the year there's a different topic on creation. We have 2 of them on creation and 1 of them is on prophecy tonight. One of them's out of print because what used to take about 3 months to put in the order and get books, the new mid-COVID reality is it now takes about 6 months. So those were supposed to be here a month ago and they might be here in another month. But they're really, really engaging books. And a lot of the examples you're going to hear as we talk about designs that God has put into the living organisms of the world around us, that not little fun, interesting things that have helped them survive, but things that have totally changed the entire course of human history, completely turned humanity's direction up and down because we've discovered something God has made out there in creation. Those are the kind of things I'm going to talk about tonight. And you'll find all sorts of examples of that and parts of our body and anatomy and cool bugs and insects and fossils and dinosaurs. Every page is a different topic. And it's like, it's 365 tracks in one. And people love to buy them and give them away. Now, second resource is my newsletter. It comes out 4 times a year. I mail it, and since I'm a nonprofit ministry, it's like 18 cents to mail one of these and about 20 cents to print one. And it's more effective than just sending an email. So I'm going to pass around a sign up. Grab one of our past newsletters. The one from Christmas talks about the 3rd biblical account of Jesus' birth that people don't typically talk about in church services. They talk about the one in Matthew and the one in Luke. This one deals with the account of Jesus' birth in the book of John. And it's kind of a neat look at things. So I'm going to pass that around for a newsletter sign up. And it's no cost. If you're busy, you can toss them in the trash and not feel guilty. But if you're not, you can keep track of what God's doing with our ministry. During COVID, I spent 2 years with another co-author writing the 4th of these creation devotionals. And it's called Without Excuse, because every human being is without excuse for belief in God. Why? It comes from Romans chapter 1, verse 19 and 20. Because they can observe what he has made. So nobody will ever live thousands of years ago today, a child, a professor, a worker, a common man of the street, and be able to stand before God and say, I would have believed in you if I'd only knew you existed. I would have obeyed you if I just knew you were there. Every human being already knows it because they just have to look at what God has made. And tonight is going to be packed with those kind of examples. This is my favorite of every devotional I've produced so far over probably a 12-year period. It's filled with examples of why and how the world can be so blind to what is so obvious, filled with historical examples of what's happened when cultures have walked away from the principles of the Bible. So you can kind of look at the manuscript of the book. Lots of beautiful 2-page spreads, like there would be 2 different pages here, and they're both about the characteristics of an owl, and so on. So great book. Don't have them in hand. They're floating here on their way from China. Hate to even use that nasty word, but they're almost twice as much if I get them printed here in the U.S. And all of our hardcover, full color, coffee table quality books are 3 for $25. Because we're a ministry, we make about $1 or so on them and use that to print more books. So, but they're affordable to give away. So great tools. Last thing that I just dropped in my lap. One of my co-authors, they wrote the first devotional called A Closer Look at the Evidence. This is the soft cover version of it. Then they've spent the last 2 years, which deals with creation, Genesis, the beginning of things. They spent the last couple years writing a book called A Closer Look at Prophecy, which looks at 365 prophecies in the Bible, some of them about Jesus, some of them about Israel, by category, some about prophetic previews of what was going to come, like the lamb being a preview of Christ, the lamb who took away the sins of the world. Things about yet to come and so on. But really fascinating book. And it shows the timelessness of God. God is outside of time because time is part of his creation. So he knows every single thing that's ever going to happen to us. And if it's happening, he must be allowing it. And we should take incredible comfort in that and how we get past the problems and issues of life. So both those books are included in a game that I've called A Closer Look at Trivia Game. And the subtitle is Biblical Knowledge from Beginning to End, Genesis to Revelation, Creation to Completion is Not Trivial. And it's just a fun game. You play 10 rounds. It's got hundreds of cards. Now we're going to just open up the audience instead of a joke. We're going to test your creation knowledge. As the folks who come to these meetings month after month, year after year, you ought to know all of these. For instance, since I'm in Arizona, what desert animal can lay dormant in the mud for 11 months, only coming out 1 month of the year because it hears hard rainfall? Wait. Multiple choice. Is it the horsefly, the horny lizard, the painted turtle, or the spadefoot toad? Okay, how many think horsefly? 11 months dormant, then comes out. Nah, they're around all year. The horny lizard? No? The painted turtle? Raise your hand. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Okay. Or the spadefoot toad? Ooh, you guys know your critters. It is D. And the fun thing is, you read the book? No, not necessarily. Well, maybe. By the way, in the game you get 2 little chips, so you can use those to look up the answer in the book and with a little 60-second timer. But you better not overuse them because you want to save them for things you're not the least bit sure of. But you get to share some of these things God has done. And that's what's fun about a trivia game. They get a little extra information on the back. The answer is D, but this toad waits for a large enough rainstorm to form pools of water which will last for several weeks. At that point, they emerge, mate, lay eggs that hatch within a week, and the young toads eat continually for the next 2 weeks, at which point the pool dries up, they dig themselves into the mud and go dormant for another 11 months. Who could do that but God? It's like, what a way to live. What a life cycle. And all of those abilities to live there, not eat or drink or move or do anything without their muscles atrophy and their bodies drying up, all of those things had to have been there from the moment they were first born and created. I mean, you take a normal toad, you throw it under some mud, you cover it up, and you don't let it do anything for 11 months, it's not going to adapt and evolve into a toad that lives. It's going to be a dead toad. It's all got to be there. Last little warm-up, then we'll get started. What animal has an ingenious heat exchanger in its head so it can cool its blood as it runs? Is it A, the gazelle, B, the cheetah, C, the elephant, D, the ostrich? Has a heat exchanger in its head. Okay, how many think A? Raise your hand, you got to participate. The gazelle. Nobody. B, the cheetah. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Hey, no looking at the guy who runs the creation group. C, the elephant. Big head, a lot of, okay, a couple of you. D, the ostrich. Okay, it's pretty split. A lot of different opinion. It's the gazelle. Its bone structure allows the blood to circulate in a cross-current pattern so air moving through its nasal passages cool the blood. This animal needs to run at high speeds to escape predators, but this exertion generates enormous amounts of heat. Pools of blood in special chambers in its nasal passage allow air rushing through to remove the heat and efficiently cool its blood. Very different than the design of almost any other animal. Pretty neat. So anyway, the game with both books and all the cards and everything is $20. And it's a great way to get the wonder of God out there in front of people. So, all right, now, let me take a drink and a breath, and we'll get started. All right. One of my favorite lectures. I'm going to have a lot of participation. Now, I'm going to start with the very first command of God to human beings. God said, and this is Genesis 1:28, he's just made male and female at this point. Chapter 1 of Genesis is an overview of all the big creation things. Chapter 2 of Genesis is the zoom-in close focus on the most important part of creation, which was mankind. They're not two creation accounts. They're an amplification of what happened first. But God blessed them and said, be fruitful, multiply, replenish. That's ancient King James. It really means fill. That word at the time meant to fill the earth, to subdue it, have dominion, you'll notice that's in red, over the fish, the birds, and everything that moves. Now that ancient word dominion, it literally means, if you go into the various nuances and aspects of it, it means to study, understand, and control. I mean, you can't have dominion, charge over something, unless you understand it well. You can't be in charge unless you're in control. So studying, understanding, and controlling. That, in essence, is science. That is what science does. Looks at the creation in order to develop things and improve our lives and discover and modify and adapt. It studies, understands, and controls what it finds. God told us to do science. Now, here's my first question. Why? God is outside of time. He knew Adam and Eve were going to sin. He knew mankind was going to worship creation, to squander creation, to covet creation, to waste and pollute and destroy creation. He knew that it was going to cause countless wars and bloodshed and agony and grief throughout time. And yet his very first command was for us to take control over it. Now, I'm not going to throw it out for comments. I'm going to give you two verses that I've come to the conclusion are these really, really important reasons why God gave us that as our first command after being fruitful and multiplying, filling it. Number one, we find in Romans, and I just referred to that. That which may be known about God is obvious to everybody, for God's shown it to them. The invisible things from the creation of the world are seen, being understood by what has been made. We can very understand even God's power and nature, his Godhead. So every human being is without excuse for belief in God. You couldn't be more crystal clear. Creation is there so that we will know God exists, not hope he exists, not think, well, maybe there's something behind it all, not even believe, but to know that couldn't have just happened. And the more we study these creatures God made, the more it becomes very, very apparent. We'll see a few of those tonight. So that's reason number one. Take dominion so we'll know he exists. Number two is the subject of tonight, and it comes out of the book of Job. In that long dialogue, one of the things that is said is, ask the beasts and they shall teach you, or birds of the air and they shall tell you. We can learn things by looking at what God has made that we would never have figured out probably any other way. And that's where we're going to jump off. And I'm talking about the things that have totally changed the course of human history, not just some little interesting, wow, look how pretty that flower is, and maybe I should make a paper flower like it and put it in a vase. And I'm going to start with this little video. Whoop, hang on a second. I'm going to back up. I got to turn on my speaker. I'm going to start with this little fish that does something no other fish in the world can do. And he's made something under the ocean. So watch this great artistic sculpture of a fish.
This small Japanese pufferfish is dull, almost to the point of invisibility. But compensate, he is probably nature's greatest artist. To grab female's attention, he creates something that almost defies belief. His only tools are his fins. In his head, a plan of mathematical perfection. He ploughs the sand, breaking it up into the finest of particles. These shells aren't just rubbish to be removed. He uses them to decorate the ridges of his construction. He can't rest for more than a moment and must work 24 hours a day for a week, or the current will destroy his creation.
Uh-oh. Hang on just a second. Did this the other day too. Let's start it. Restart it.
This small Japanese pufferfish is dull.
Isn't that cool? Perfectly circular. It's this gorgeous sculpture.
As an animal constructs something as complex and perfect as this. If this doesn't get him noticed, nothing will.
Okay, now we'll come back to that statement in a moment, but that sculpture is, the fish is, maybe 6 inches long, and to the best of my estimate looking at it, it's probably 10 foot in diameter. That fish never swims up above it to look at what it's doing. It just shoves sand around with its head and makes a absolutely perfect circle of incredible beauty with all these ridges. And they're all a little different, but they're all perfect in their nature. Now, if we tried to do that, shove sand around with our head and make a perfect circle, it'd have to be from here all the way out across the street, that big in diameter. And nobody here could do it. It would not be perfect. Yet that fish can do it. It's the only fish that does it. Now, those who believe in evolution, they have to explain that. Where did that beauty and that ability come from? And why does that fish spend all that energy? See, it's expending an enormous amount of energy to create something of great beauty. Why, if it's trying to just attract a mate, why not just build a little mound? Why does it have to be so beautiful, so big, so complex, so take so long? So that idea that beauty is here because it has some useful evolutionary function has been told all since after the time of Darwin. For instance, the peacock is gorgeous. In every textbook will say peacocks or birds who are beautiful or flowers that are beautiful. They have all the color and all the beauty so they can attract insects to pollinate them, or so he can attract a mate, a babe. That fish made that beautiful sculpture so a babe will come mate with him. Well, nice story, but is it true? Now, Darwin recognized this issue. He made this statement about peacocks. This is Charles Darwin in 1860, right after he published Origin of Species. The sight of a feather in a peacock's tail, whenever I gaze at it, makes me sick. Why would he say that? Because he couldn't explain beauty. Well, the very next folks along, and ever since for 150 years, constantly the students are told beauty exists because it has a functional purpose, and therefore it allows animals to adapt and gives an advantage. All that energy that fish expended gives it an advantage. Except whenever we test it, we find out it's not true. Insects are colorblind. They can't see colors and beautiful beauty of the flower. They took a male peacock and cut off all of those beautiful parts of its feathers, so it was pug ugly. And then they sent it into a field with a whole bunch of beautiful peacocks and a whole bunch of peahens, females. And then they said, which peacock is it going to choose? Didn't make a bit of difference. The beauty had nothing to do with desirability or reproduction. Beauty is a reflection of the nature of the Creator, who is beautiful beyond comprehension. And there's never been an evolutionary explanation that really works when it's tested. It's just storytelling. Let's leave God out and try to explain things as if it all made itself. But when you test it, it doesn't work. So we saw this big wheel-like structure under the ocean. We're going to look first at transportation. That's my kickoff to transportation. Now, I'm not saying that ancient man was scuba diving and saw this and therefore invented the wheels. I mean, here's Gary Larson's explanation. Where did transportation come from? Here's ancient man trying to figure it out. And always people are portrayed as stupid, eventually getting smart. Another one, I just love this one. Fag becomes the first fatality of falling asleep at the wheel. Here comes the saber-toothed tiger. It's just fun to make fun of these things. And by the way, I just have to mention, I spent about 2 years after I left Dow at age 49, I produced a book called Brilliant, Made in the Image of Man. And like every 2-page spread, there's a timeline, and then there's some artifact from an ancient culture. Like this is from down in Peru, the Nazca lines that are like football stadium size depictions that have been scraped in deserts of hummingbirds and trees and all sorts of creatures. Just enormously beautiful things. We have no idea how or when they made them, but they're there. And it shows how all these cultures were brilliant from the beginning. But let's look at another mode of transportation as we start to walk through inventions that have changed humanity. And the first one is flight. Now, I think mankind, from Adam and Eve's creation, have looked at the birds and wished, man, I wish I could fly. When I was growing up, I had a reoccurring dream that I could fly. Anybody, who else? This is just interesting. Every audience I ask this, so 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 of us, 8, over and over again for years would have this reoccurring dream that we could fly. It's kind of neat how that shows up in people. But what they did was look at the birds. Now, it wasn't until about 1840 we developed photography, 1850 time frame, and we had 10 types of the Civil War. And they started stringing them together in the 1880s. Edison had invented the movies. So some early movies of mankind's attempt to fly were saved from the 1890s all up in the early 1900s. And you can find these on the internet. And I actually strung a bunch of them together. Mankind's attempt to fly. So watch this little montage. Okay. Now, what did they all have in common? Wings, feathers, imitating birds. Because birds can fly and we couldn't. Now, they had the shape of the wing right for the most part on most of those attempts, but it didn't work. You know, it wasn't until 2 Christian young men who ran a bicycle shop and were just wonderful inventors. Their father was a Presbyterian minister, Orville and Wilbur Wright, realized it wasn't just the shape of the wing. You had to get that shape moving fast enough through air. And then because it's moving further to go up and around the wing than to go below it, you form a low pressure area and you achieve lift. So if you can get that shape moving fast enough, it will lift incredibly heavy objects off the ground, including a man sitting on a large mechanical object. So they took all this and they tested it in North Carolina at Kitty Hawk. And it was in December of 1903, only about 118 years ago. For the first time in 6,000 years since the creation of Adam and Eve, mankind had controlled, lifted off the ground flight, sustained flight. And that first flight just went in a straight line a couple hundred feet and landed. They continued. A few days later, they went and they've got some newspaper reporters and a film crew, still in 1903 in December, and they filmed themselves flying. And this time, both Orville and Wilbur, you'll see both of them climbing onto the airplane. Now there are two of them on this plane. And watch the, and this just stuns me, even now, and I've seen it dozens of times. We captured the first time man had flown. One of those first few times. Watch this little film. I didn't realize it, but they lifted a great big heavy weight up in a tower, and the plane was attached to that weight. So it wasn't just the propeller that moved it fast enough to get it up in the air. It was thrown forward like something off an aircraft carrier. There goes the weight, there goes the plane. These guys are stunned. They can't believe what they're seeing. Mankind is flying. It's incomprehensible. And they just came in for a landing. They're not just flying, they're banking and turning and circling the field and coming in for a smooth landing. You know, it is like we are little 3, 4-year-old kindergarten children. And God is like more than Einstein. It's not even a close comparison. And God made this enormous creation, including the cosmos and the stars and the animals and the plants and all the principles of science in which to use it and develop it and enjoy it. And he says, here's your sandbox. Go play in the sandbox. Isn't it cool? They're playing in God's sandbox. And why and how? Because they saw what birds could do. And think of how aviation has increased. The knowledge is built upon knowledge is built on knowledge in only 118 years. And it's just not just learning to fly. You see, as we learn to fly faster and faster and faster, leading all the way up to jet engines eventually, you had to have planes that were much more maneuverable and much more controllable. And designers started to look, and not just birds, which birds are really good and really fast and can really control things well. And you can actually find the historical examples of the early designers. They started looking at a bird called a swift, okay? Now the swift is the fastest bird God has created on level flying. Now, like a peregrine falcon can dive at over 200 miles an hour, but on a straight level flight, nothing can beat a swift. It's like you're driving along, looking over your shoulder for the police on an expressway because you're going 80. This bird's going to go past you like you're almost standing still. 104 miles an hour. And it flies almost continually. They've been tracked and then multiplied by their lifetime. They think they'll fly 2.5 million miles in their lifetime. That's to the moon and around the moon and back to Earth 6 times or 100 times around the entire Earth. They don't even stop to drink. A swift will just swoop down, open its mouth, grab some water, and swoop back up. Won't even stop to take a drink of water because it just likes to fly. Doesn't want to stop. It sleeps while it's flying. It doesn't roost at night. You see, it has the ability to shut down half of its brain and close one eye. And then it just flies along while it's sleeping. And then it shuts the other eye and the other half of the brain. And that's how it rests its brain while it's flying. It doesn't even want to stop to make babies. It mates in the air. Only stops to build a nest and lay the eggs. So if you're going to look at a bird that's really maneuverable, really fast, and absolutely a wonder of aviation, look at a bird that loves to fly. And that's what they did, because the early planes, the Wright brothers planes, they just had wings straight out. The World War II biplanes, wings straight out. World War I planes, wings are straight out. Early airliners, the wings are straight out. But as we got faster, Look what happens to every airplane design that we have. The wings are swept back because of the swift. See, we're still learning from creation and then duplicating it. Another example, great big planes, when they come in for a landing, they're flying along at 400, 450 miles an hour, but they have to slow down to about below 200, 150. They're so heavy, they're gonna lose lift. When you lose lift, you start fluttering like a leaf. It's called stalling, and you're gonna crash. So how are you gonna slow that enormously heavy plane down enough so that it can land safely without a 5-mile long runway without crashing? They looked at big birds. And they realized these big birds, they have these little extra feathers that pop out as they come down and land. Here's another example, a big old Canada goose. Whoops, okay. Has these big feathers that pop out as it's coming down to land. What does that do? It forces even more air up and over the wing and increases the amount of lift. Anybody know what that's leading to in an airplane design? The ailerons, right in the front of every wing. If you're ever near a window of the wing, you'll see them pop up. It creates more lift as the airplane slows down, but they cause all kinds of drag while the airplane's going fast. So they have to be deployable, just like the birds. That's where they got the idea. Last example, not necessarily to do with flight, but it's kind of interesting. I was in the woods like this is a long time ago, just walking late in the evening at dusk, and all of a sudden, an enormous object, scared the dickens out of me, came zipping right past my head. Now, I didn't hear a thing. It's just all of a sudden, my peripheral vision, and then right past me is this enormous object. It was a barn owl. And they have a wingspan like this. They are big, but it was totally silent. No rustling of wind or anything. Now, what does that have to do with flight? He's like the stealth fighter of the avian world. He can catch rabbits and mice and stuff, and they don't even know he's coming. Incredible eyesight at night. Well, early computer designers, when they came out with the Commodore 64 in the 90s, they were really inefficient and they generated a lot of heat. And you had to have a fan in order to keep it cool enough to keep it from burning up. But these fans were loud. They were like, and it's really loud. It's the loudest thing in your room when you turn on your computer. So they started looking, how do we move air without making a lot of noise? What in nature can move through air without making a lot of noise? An owl. It's really silent. So they started looking really, really close at its wings. And if you look at its wings, you see these notches. As it deploys the individual feathers, you'd think it'd be a lot more rustling. But somehow, as the air rushes past these notches in the wing, a little nodule at the end of the wing, in essence, it disrupts the turbulence so that it doesn't make much noise. So here is a computer fan based on that principle, and we've seen them. They have these little knobs at the end of the fins. And they're way, way quieter, even spinning at the same speed, based on the design of an owl's wing. So that's flight. Now, what I'm talking about this whole lecture is biomimicry. Bio means its biological origin. Mimic means to copy or duplicate. And almost every major engineering college or even medical college has a course on biomimicry because we know we can learn so much from nature. Now, here's the tragic part. Every time the students are just immediately told all these things exist because they're useful. And if they're useful because evolution modified things in order to create them. Never in any public university, except occasionally a Christian professor will hint at it, but if he's overt, he'll just be removed from his position, that it had to have an intelligent designer, just like nothing in engineering happens unless there's an engineer designing the parts to come together and work in that way. It's just assumed, the word evolution's thrown at it, that it made itself because it's useful. And we're going to come back to that at the very end of the lecture. But now we're just going to walk through some things that have changed human history. First one is the Osage orange tree changed American history. Totally we may have been 100 years behind where we are today if it wasn't for the Osage orange tree. Anybody guesses what was invented because someone looked at this tree? Anything? Yes? Okay, thanks. Don't give it away if you already know.
Something that helped tame the West.
Okay, we'll get back to that. All right. Thanks for jumping ahead. I'm not going to call on you again. But I often get people saying golf balls, basketballs. And I'm thinking, well, sports is interesting. Yes.
Horton's Just Spec.
What is that?
Horton from Dr. Seuss.
Oh, yeah. Nope. He may have got the idea, but that's not what I'm thinking of. Yeah, I'm going to kind of walk you through it, give you a few clues. This tree inspired an invention to a man named Michael Kelly, and it happened back in 1868, okay? So a little less than 100 years after the foundation of our country. It sells 200 million pounds per year to this day. Invented that long ago, and it still sells 200 million pounds of it. And if you could string it together every year, it would be 1 million miles long, and the next year another 1 million miles of it. Now, 1 million miles is a lot. It's lots and lots and lots and lots of times around the earth. Now, let me give you the background. In the East, we would build fences out of picket, laying just logs back and forth. Didn't even need nails necessarily, just pegs, and you'd have a fence because there was lots of wood. Now, in the early 1800s, and I forget the exact date, but it's 18, probably 5 or 6 or 7. Jefferson had the chance to buy a little Louisiana territory from France because they were at war and they needed money. And they sold the entire Mississippi drainage valley all the way from the Dakotas and Kansas and Nebraska, all the way into Ohio and Illinois, all of it for 3 cents an acre. It was the land bargain of the millennium, of the Earth's history. And we owned it. It doubled the size of the United States at the stroke of a pen. And by the way, Jefferson was criticized. What are you wasting government funds for? But it started an expansion of this country to the west, like nothing else in history had. Lewis and Clark's expedition was because of that. But in order for people to head out west and survive, they had to have supply cities. So St. Louis and Chicago turned into major metropolitan areas within a decade. Cities that used to be tens of thousands turned into cities of close to 1 million. An agricultural society started to turn into an urban society. But you had to feed people that weren't raising their own food. And one of the most efficient sources of food is cattle. But if you've got to chase cattle all over Kansas to get your herd to market, it's really inefficient, and you're not going to make money, and you're not even going to bother doing it. So farmers would build fences, but in the Great Plains, there were no trees. So what they did was plant Osage orange trees, and they would start out as hedges. Now, this is what they looked like, huge fields with all these hedges for penning in cattle. Why would the cattle not just push right through it? Because the branches of these trees look like that. And just like we wouldn't like pushing through that, neither does a cow. Those things hurt. Now do you know what the invention is? Barbed wire. Barbed wire fences. Now look at barbed wire and look at the Osage orange branch. Michael Kelly called his company the Osage Orange Barbed Wire Company. Nobody thought of it before. Seems obvious in hindsight, but that is what made the feeding of a nation economically viable in the westward expansion, to happen so rapidly, because we could supply and feed all these people that are now urbanized people. One of the resources I looked up said it wasn't the Colt 44 that tamed the West. It was barbed wire that tamed the West. It allowed ownership of land and profitable raising of food that were needed by a nation that was expanding rapidly. All because God had done it first. Just cool. It's just so cool. All right, here's another one. Change humanity like unbelievably. Because some French guy, whom I can't even pronounce his name, René Antoine Ramour. I can't do French. But this is back in 1719. He was taking a walk in the woods and he got stung, okay? Now, most of us would just curse or get mad or get irritated or swat him away. But instead, he kind of steps back and he kind of looks at this big wasp nest that he blundered under. Now here's a little one, okay? You got where the eggs are laid, but surrounding it is this really, really thin, really, really flat, fine paper. Now the Europeans knew about paper, but they had no way to manufacture it. The Japanese and Chinese had been doing paper for 2,000, 3,000 years, but there was no mass manufacturing process. And he thought, you know, if this stupid little stinging insect can make a paper that's thinner, flatter, and finer than what we make our books out of, which at that time was linen. It was like fibers from cloth that were cast very thin and sewn together. They're called binding books. So only rich people could afford them. Why can't we do it? And he spent years, upwards of a decade, developing a process to mass manufacture paper in the same way that wasps would do it, by dissolving the pulp in alkaline chemicals and then casting them and intertwining them and created paper. Now I want you to think about what would the world be like had this man not looked at this insect, or no one had taken time to figure it out. First of all, we'd have no newspapers. The paperboy industry would be out, well, that's out of business anyway. Nobody reads the newspaper. Bad example. But, you know, okay, fun stuff like, you know, paper airplanes. No paper airplanes because nothing to fold. How about books? You know, what drove the Reformation and the scientific revolution was the printing press. And what allowed the common man to own, read, and capture knowledge was the invention of paper. There'd be no books other than sewn together cloth linen books without paper. And then there's, you know, you wouldn't get junk mail. Well, that's a bad example, but you wouldn't be able to send mail without paper, no envelopes. And here's a good one. We'd still be walking around with a pocket full of coins. All our coins would be metal. You're starting to get the picture? How about, that's not the last one. How about the quicker picker-upper? You'd have to use your laundry to soak up spills in the kitchen. And then, where would Amazon.com be without cardboard? Oh, and this is because of that wasp. We'd still be shipping stuff around in a barrel. But I haven't even come to the most significant, the most astounding, the most important use of paper. What about the toilet paper? There we go. We'd still be going out in the woods collecting leaves. All because of the wasp. See, it's changed history because God told us to go study creation. A little beetle. There was a man, John Buford Cox, 1946, not that long ago, taking his lunch break in the woods. He's worked hard, sweating like crazy, finally gets a lunch break, sits down on a stump, and as he's eating his lunch, he looks, and there's this little beetle crawling across the stump, and he notices it's got these little mandibles. It's like little pinchers, and they're like going back and forth and back and forth and back and forth, and it's chewing up the fibers on top of this stump as he's watching it. And he just gets closer and closer, and looks and thinks, that's really interesting. Why did that matter? Because Joseph Cox was a lumberjack, and he just spent all morning with a crosscut saw sawing back and forth on trees. Now, they had chainsaws in 1946 and before, but they had put teeth just like a saw. One teeth's a little point, it angles out one way. The next tooth has a little point, angles out the other way. Put it on a chain, and they go round and around. Two men on a crosscut saw could actually outsaw a chainsaw when it was made that way. It just wasn't that efficient. But he thought, you know, what's different? What's different about that beetle? Their teeth are curved, so as it starts to bite into a wood fiber, it slices right through instead of just punching through. Just slice, 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 back and forth. So he went on to look at that, machine pieces of metal that had that little curved shape, put them opposing each other on this chain that would go round and around, and he created chainsaw blades. And if you look at them very closely, You can see they've got this curved shape this way and then a curved shape that way, and you sharpen them by just cutting them further and further back, but they keep that curved shape. 10 times more efficient than a little point. He created the Oregon Chainsaw Company, one of the major chainsaw companies of the day, and it allowed the harvesting of lumber and the building of structures across the world much, much, much more rapidly. Last major technological development came about because of the smallest bones in a human body. Who knows what are the smallest bones in our body? Yep, you're pointing to the ear. The stirrup, the anvil, and the hammer are the common names. Now, oh, by the way, I've got to do this. Didn't do this last time. One more trivia question. This is on the back of the box. Where is it? Our ears are so sensitive that they can detect a sound wave, something that moves air, that bumps against our eardrum, that moves our eardrum only this much. The thickness of a hair. When that sound wave can move our eardrum the thickness of a hair, we'll hear it as a sound. That's option A. Each option is a little bit smaller. The thickness of a sheet of paper, that's about 4 times smaller than a hair. That's B. The thickness of a bacteria, that's about 100 times smaller than the thickness of a hair. Or the diameter of an atom, it's about 10,000 times smaller than the thickness of a hair. Which one? Your eardrum moves that much, we'll know it's a sound that's been made. A hair. Oh, nobody ever picks the first answer. I gotta put more of the right answers in there, A. B, the thickness of a sheet of paper. One. C, the thickness of a bacteria. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. D, the diameter of an atom. 1, 2, 3, 4, looks like thickness of a bacteria wins. Okay, you gotta buy the game to find the answer. Okay. No, I'm kidding. It's actually the diameter of an atom. 0.00000001 inches. When your eardrum moves that much, you will know a sound has been made. Astounding. And it's because of these 3 bones. That eardrum moves that much, it is amplified by those bones and where they're placed in their structure. Those bones then move a fluid that moves little hairs inside the fluid that are attached to nerves that send a signal to your brain. It's an astounding system. Now, what invention changed everything? Everything we know and see and are about in modern technology because of those 3 bones. Don't you dare answer this. Here's your clue. This is a quote by the man who made this invention. He said, "It occurred to me that if a membrane as thin as tissue paper, way thinner than this toilet paper, that's our eardrum, thinner than tissue paper, could control the vibrations of bones that are immense in comparison to that little tissue paper, okay? That thing moves the distance of an atom, and it's controlling the movement in those bones. Why couldn't a larger, thicker membrane vibrate pieces of iron that were in front of it, and those iron, if they're in front of an electromagnet, could do something else?" What are we talking about? Say it really loud. Speakers, but not just speakers, okay? Who do you think made that quote? Bell. That's a quote by Alexander Graham Bell when asked, what gave you the inspiration for inventing the telephone? That's his most famous invention, the telephone, Bell telephone. This is what did it for him. You see, he invented it in 1876, and he wasn't a scientist. He wasn't an electrical engineer. He was a vocal physiologist. He was in the medical industry. But he had a deaf mother and a deaf wife. And he was trying to figure out, how does an ear function? What are the parts that make it work? And then he started to think, how else could it be put useful? You see, if you put iron filings in front of a vibrating membrane, it moves those iron filings. If there's a magnet there, moving iron in front of a magnet that's attached to a wire creates electrical current moving through that wire, and it will pulse up or down at various amplitudes and in periodic time frames that then at the speed of light will show up at the other end of that wire. You now put iron filings in front of a magnet, it will create those movement in those iron filings, so it will then move a membrane on the other side. The moving membrane will create sound waves. So you convert sound to an electrical signal at one end. In that way, you create the electrical signal, creates sound coming back out at the other end, the receiver and the microphone. You have to have both to have a telephone. And he invented all of it because of the design of the ear. Would have never invented it if that had not been there. A little bit of trivia. What was the first message ever transmitted over wire? Remember that? You've learned this in school. Anybody?
Somebody had a little lamb.
No. Yes. I love it when I get that answer. That's the wrong answer, but you're on the right track. That was the first message transmitted over a telephone by Alexander Graham Bell. You're right. His assistant, don't answer yet. I'm going to get to it because I got a really important point. I'll let you say it in a second, okay? But his assistant was named Watson. He was in a different room and made history by saying, "Watson, come here." And very statically, he heard it and came, those words, and those words were transmitted. It was the first human words transmitted by an electrical signal. But it wasn't the first message transmitted over a wire. A man named Samuel Morse. What were you going to say?
I thought it was a hymn or something, the words of a verse or something.
It was, and I'll show you what it is. Samuel Morse was the first man to transmit a message over a wire. Samuel Morse invented Morse code. Dot, dot, dash, dash, dot, 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 dot. Electrical signal could send it across a wire for 100 miles or more and be picked up as a dot, dot, dash, dash, dot, 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 dot at the other end. It's a message being sent over a wire. Samuel Morse was a strong Bible-believing Christian. He wanted the very first message ever transmitted over a wire to be really significant. This was the message. It was, "What has God wrought?" Now, wrought is an ancient King James word that means made. What has God made? That's what this whole lecture is about. Looking at what God has made has changed all of human history. I mean, without Morse code followed by the telephone, there would be no telephones, there'd be no transmissions of language to each other, there'd be no earbuds, there'd be no cell phones, there'd be no need for satellites, there'd be no televisions, there'd be none of that. There'd be no stereos, no record players. None of it would exist without speakers and microphones, all because God made the ear. Now, I'm going to just jump through a few fairly quick. How are we doing? Yeah, we're doing okay on time. Just useful inventions, not necessarily changing humanity, but really, really useful. This next invention was, again, invented by a Frenchman walking through the woods. He comes back and his dog is just covered with these nasty, sticking seed pods, just irritating. You got to pick them all off one at a time. But instead of being irritated, he spent 10 years trying to figure out, how did God do this? And how can I copy it? And this invention is used on the International Space Station. It is the most common method of doing something on all Apollo missions, all spacewalks, everything the astronauts do in outer space. It's used by little children, 2 and 3 years old. It's used in multiple functions across our lives. And it created, it was 14 years in development, a $1 billion industry, employs thousands of people to this day, even though it was invented 80 years ago. And it's because the guy looked very closely at this. Guesses? Velcro. Exactly. But he didn't just immediately figure out how to do it. He studied it and tested and tried and retested and retried, because you have to have this little hook that's super flexible and bounces back and does it 1,000 times. And on a small enough scale, you can hardly even see it. So you've got little hooks and you've got little fibers that like to grab onto the hooks. And we stick everything together with it. Here's what it looks like on a microscopic scale. Grabs those little fibers and holds onto them. Just like the cockabur and 1,000 other little seed pods God invented first. What can you learn from a dog's paw? okay? This is another really useful invention that everybody uses now that it's been figured out. And it's obvious now that we've realized what it does. See, there was a man named Paul Sperry, 1935, loved to sail. Every chance he'd get, he'd go out sailing off the East Coast, and he'd take his Cocker Spaniel with him. Now, he would have on his leather deck shoes, and he noticed that as he'd run across a wet deck, they would often slip, and he would even fall and have to grab a rope. But his Cocker Spaniel was really sure-footed. It could run back and forth across a wet deck, and it wouldn't be slipping and falling like he was. And he started looking at this dog's foot, and he thought, you know, this dog has leather pads just like my shoes. Now, I've got one big continuous leather pad because from the early turn of the millennium all the way up into the 1900s, cobblers made shoes with leather bottoms, and that leather surface, the more surface, the more traction. So that should have given you really good traction. And he thought, this dog has these leather pads too, but he noticed there's two leather pads and there's like a channel in between. It's kind of like a V-shaped channel. And these, if you connect them, is a V-shaped channel. And these, if you connect them, is a V-shaped channel. So you got all these V-shaped channels between the pads. He went on to invent the herringbone pattern on the bottom of deck shoes, the first thing they were used for. We now, in one way or another, every tennis shoe made, every automobile tire made, has these little pads with V-shaped patterns between them, whether they're knobs or actual connected channels. And they allow water to channel away so that the part that is needed to provide traction can firmly touch the bottom and shove the water into the channels. That's all the dog's paw was doing. By looking at the dog's paws, he changed locomotion and transportation in both automobiles and people's shoes. Now, this is just fun. I mean, God made a fish that looks like a box. What was God thinking? Talk about a stupid design, a terrible shape. I mean, he must have had a really off day the day he decided to make the box fish. As a matter of fact, Science magazine, they made this statement. They said, this fish should swim about as well as a barn should fly. It's a terrible aerodynamic shape. Except scuba divers noticed that on coral reefs where the water's sweeping back and forth and these beautiful colored fish live, the long, skinny fish often would get swept sideways and swept along with the current. The box fish are just flapping their little fins and just maintaining position really well. So that led to these stupid, ridiculous, box-shaped cars. What are the auto designers thinking? They literally took the design of the box fish and tried to figure out, why does it work underwater? Well, they put, this is actually in the early 90s, Daimler Chrysler spent probably tens of millions of dollars, and they took the exact design of a box fish, the best they could, and designed a car with those same angles, same proportions, same shapes, and they put it in wind tunnels, and they realized by copying the shape of this fish, there are vortexes that form at the corners that are like in the reverse direction of the wind that's pushing back, and they kind of counteract the drag that's sweeping past the shape. This was a concept design. That vortex flow at the corners gave it great aerodynamic efficiency, great maneuverability, and it got 70 miles per gallon because of the design of the box fish. Isn't that cool? It's just cool. And then there's construction techniques. There's a little girl sitting on this real thin little paper towel thick membrane on top of a giant lily pad. And people can actually, a full-size 180-pound man can actually step from pad to pad to pad. And as long as he doesn't tip it over, it'll support his weight. That real thin membrane. I'm going to come back to that. This is what it looks like underneath. It's got this big arteries with little side support arteries supporting that thin membrane. In 1851, the world decided we're in the middle of the Industrial Revolution. Mankind is developing all sorts of stuff, the cotton gin and locomotions and electric motors and all this stuff. They decided to have what's called the World's Fair, but it was called the Great Exhibition in London, England. And they had a contest of who can design the most fabulous building ever built. The most stunning, huge structure. And all the architects of the world put in their designs, and all the engineers would send in designs. A botanist won the contest. He designed what was called the Crystal Palace, okay? And he made this proposal. It was going to be made of 200,000 panes of glass. The whole thing was going to be glass from the outside. 10 stories high, 10-story building. And it would cover 18 acres of ground, all made of glass. Now, this is what it finally looked like after it was constructed. Or this was his concept design. And just a fabulous structure showing mankind's genius. Except all the experts of the day predicted it's going to collapse. There's no way you could hold the weight of all that glass. We're talking tens of millions of pounds. His design was based on the giant lily pad. He took the same ratio of size and structures and girders and side support beams and constructed the entire building, and it was fine. It lasted for decades. Finally collapsed because of a fire that started inside of it and weakened the metal, and then it collapsed. One last example of construction, the human hip. There was another World's Fair in 1889, and this time an engineer, not an architect, but an engineer, it was a contest to build the tallest building ever created by mankind as the center showcase of this World's Fair at this city. Now, before 1889, the tallest structure mankind had ever built had been built almost 4,000 years earlier. It held the record for 4,000 years. It was the Great Pyramid of Giza. And that was, I believe, built shortly after the flood in those first 500 or so years. And it wasn't until almost 3,900 years later that this man proposed a structure that was going to be taller and would be freestanding and not collapse. Any guesses? The Paris building. Yeah. His last name? Eiffel. Gustav Eiffel. Tower, 1,063 feet tall. It was based on the design of the human hip. All other buildings were built with the massive weight exactly centered over the center structure and supported by the walls, straight up. But eventually there's so much weight that building starts to wobble and it falls, and you just can't get higher, too high. They didn't have modern skyscraper construction techniques. But he looked at the human hip and he thought, God has built our bodies so that our weight is actually right here, and yet the support system is off to one side, and our legs stretch out to each side of that. So let's just do 4 of those and build a huge, tall, very stable structure, the Eiffel Tower. All the experts of the day predicted it would collapse. There's no way it'll survive. Based on God's design, it's there to this day. Really cool. I'm going to jump past this one because I've belabored things. But the medical industry literally has developed not hundreds, but thousands of medicines based on chemicals found inside of plants and animals. Everything from painkillers to cancer cures to diabetic medicine, liver medicine, infection medicine, headache medicine, antibiotics, all of it from chemicals God has made naturally. Study creation and ye shall learn from it. Now, last example, and this is kind of relevant today. Scientists are very interested in how to kill bacteria and viruses. So they started studying what kind of animal surfaces or surfaces out there, the natural surfaces that seem to have the fewest bacteria. And maybe there's a chemical there that'll help us, an antibacterial chemical. And they found out that cicadas with their clear wings and dragonflies with their clear wings have like orders of magnitude less bacteria than other surfaces on almost every place they look. Our bodies have more bacteria crawling in and on them than we have cells in our bodies. They're everywhere. Now, 99.9% of bacteria are not harmful, and many of them are critical for our survival. But a few of them, because of the fall, and we live in a fallen creation, have gone bad as our bodies deteriorate and go bad. So they're dangerous. But in general, we got to figure out how to get rid of those bad ones. They started thinking, what kind of antibacterial stuff is on these dragonfly wings? They couldn't find anything. So then they started looking closer, and they discovered the wings themselves have these little nano spikes, billions of them on a microscopic scale, exactly spaced and designed in a way that when a bacteria lands on one, if they were too big, they wouldn't have an effect. If they were too small, they wouldn't have an effect. They're sized exactly right so that the bacteria starts to sag down on them until it's punctured and it dies. It's like a bed of nails, specifically designed exactly the right shape and size to kill bacteria. The surface itself kills the bacteria. Here's another drawing out of a technical magazine. Shows the wing of a dragonfly and the little spikes, and the bacteria lands and gravity pulls down on it, and then it deflates and it's dead. Scientists are now trying to figure out how to do this on doorknobs and bed rails and walls in hospitals and such, so they don't have to spray disinfectant. The surface itself would permanently kill bacteria. Isn't that cool? It's just cool. I mean, glory to God. How am I doing? A little bit over time. I'm going to probably go 5 more minutes if that's okay. One last tool. I took pages from this book, and I've been doing it for about 1.5 years now. And it's not like I read them or script them, but like I would tell a really cool story to a friend. I'm out on a location somewhere, and I'll talk about some really neat thing God has made in creation. And I made these little 2 to 3 minute maximum, what are called vlogs. I didn't even know what a vlog was when I started doing this. But a blog is like a written little teaching or manuscript. A vlog is a video teaching. And they come out about once a week or once every other week. So if you go to my website, and on my newsletter, you'll see my phone number, address, website, on all the books, all the magazines, everything you'll see on our website. The very first thing that pops up are, without a doubt, vlogs, 3-minute videos. If you then click on that, or you put it in your email, you'll get an email when a new one comes out. You see a list, and so far I've put out about 40 of these. And they're just neat examples of God being behind everything that you can share with the world around you. Just send the link to a friend and say, hey, these are fun to watch when they come out every week. And I want to show you one of them. And it's kind of like the sort of things we've just been talking about. So hang on, I got to shut this down and pull up. This is my website that links to these YouTube little vlogs. And I'm going to hit play and then bring it full screen. You know, whoops. There. God told us to take dominion over creation in the book of Genesis. That means to study, understand, and control it. Now why? Because we can learn so much from it. I mean, we can even learn from a slug. A slug, you say? Yeah. It turns out that there's a certain kind of slug that lives in northern Europe that slugs, when they move, they leave a slime trail. It's just kind of a sticky, gooey, watery thing. You can actually see their trail as they're crawling along. Well, scientists started to study this slug from Europe, and they realized their slime is very, very elastic. You can stretch it and it'll snap back, and very, very sticky. Now, for years, scientists have used things like super glue to bind up wounds. And they thought, it's a little toxic and it turns a little brittle. What we need is a really flexible glue that will stay sticky. And they discovered this slug slime and thought, these has the perfect characteristics for glue. Now, don't get too excited about, having some slug slime slapped onto your cut, because it takes a lot of slugs to form enough slime to fit the market. And, slug slime farms aren't exactly practical, because the slugs only exude this kind of slime when they're scared, because they don't want birds. Like if a bird's flying overhead, out comes the sticky slug slime glue. And if the bird comes and tries to pull the slug off the sidewalk, it's stuck to the sidewalk. So the only way to get the sticky glue is to scare the slugs. And slug slime farms aren't exactly practical. I mean, you set up a movie theater, you put all your slugs on the seats, and you show them movies of scary birds, and then you scrape the slug slime sticky glue off the seats. I mean, not exactly practical. So what do?
they figured out how to synthesize it. And we now have the formula for sticky slug slime glue that is currently being used to seal up wounds. Isn't that cool? Because we figured out what God did first. So we can learn from creation, develop products that benefit us in a multitude of ways, even slug slime glue. What a slugger of an idea.
So you kind of get the idea. It's just, all of us get burdened down with the concerns and busyness and problems and diseases and relationships of life. And it's just, you need that reminder that God's behind it all. And it's just a great tool. All of these things are just tools to try to impact the world around us. So I hope you enjoyed just the whole talk and the lecture tonight and put the tools to use. Get on my newsletter list. As you order these books in bulk, they come. I bring them down in price to where the soft covers are $5 each. The hard covers come down to $7 each, and you can give them to people, and it makes a difference. So thank you. I think I had fun, and I think you did too. Aha! Bonus.